I'd been dreaming about this moment for 2 years, ever since I started stashing away every extra dollar I could for this big surprise. My hands were sweaty on the steering wheel as I pulled into the driveway, my heart thumping with excitement. I'd worked overtime, skipped lunches, and bargained with every travel agent I could find to pull off this luxury trip to Europe for my wife, Marla, and her parents, Thomas and Rita. I could already picture their faces lighting up when I told them, first-class flights, fancy hotels, the works. I popped the trunk open, ready to grab the little gift bags I'd put together with the tickets inside, when I stopped dead in my tracks. There he was, Caleb, Marla's so-called friend, standing right there next to them with a suitcase in his hand like he owned the place. He wasn't just some guy she knew. He was the one who'd been hanging around way too much lately, jobless, always leaning on her for something. Marla turned to me with this big, bright smile that didn't feel right. "Caleb's been so stressed out," she said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "He needs some rest, so we decided to take him instead." My stomach dropped. I stood there, staring at her, then at Thomas and Rita, who didn't even blink, just nodded like this was all part of the plan. 2 years of saving, 2 years of dreaming, and they'd swapped me out like I was an old tire. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, but my voice stuck in my throat. What could I even say? They'd already made up their minds. So I just nodded, slow and stiff, like my neck was made of wood. I shut the trunk, climbed back into the driver's seat, and started the car. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white as I drove them toward the airport. Marla chattered about how fun it'd be. Rita hummed along, and Caleb just lounged in the back like he was already on vacation. Every mile, my heart pounded harder, not with excitement anymore, but with something else, something heavy and sharp. I kept my eyes on the road, my jaw locked shut. They didn't even ask if I was okay with this. They didn't care. I'd spent years being the guy who made things work, paying bills, fixing problems, keeping everyone happy, and this was what I got? Replaced by some lazy freeloader who couldn't even hold a job? As the airport signs came into view, I felt this cold, quiet anger settle in my chest. This wasn't a mistake they'd made. It wasn't some mix-up I could laugh off later. It was a choice. They'd picked him over me, plain and simple. And right then, something clicked in my head. I was done. Done being their backup plan, their doormat, their fool. I didn't say a word as I pulled up to the drop-off lane. I just got out, opened the doors, and let them grab their bags. Marla gave me a quick peck on the cheek, like that made it all fine, and said, "Thanks for being so sweet about this." Sweet? I forced a nod, my lips twitching into something that wasn't a smile. I watched them walk off toward the terminal, Caleb dragging his suitcase behind him like he'd earned it. My hands shook as I got back in the car, but my mind was clear. They thought I'd just sit back and take it. They thought wrong. This was my trip, my money, my effort, and if I wasn't going, nobody was. I didn't know exactly what I'd do next, but one thing was for sure. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me anymore. The engine roared as I pulled away from the curb, my foot heavy on the gas. They could have their little adventure with Caleb, but I was about to take control of something for once. And it was going to feel good. The drive to the airport felt like a war nobody else knew was happening. I kept my hands locked on the steering wheel, my eyes straight ahead, while the car filled up with their voices, Marla's, Rita's, Caleb's, like they were trying to drown out the quiet storm building inside me. Marla was going on and on about Paris, her words bouncing around the car like she was already sipping wine by the Eiffel Tower. "Oh, I can't wait to see the Louvre," she said, her voice all bubbly, like this was some dream come true. Rita chimed in, laughing about how she'd need a whole extra suitcase for all the shopping she planned to do. "Those French scarves, you know, they're just divine," she said, her tone light and careless. Caleb, sprawled out in the back seat like he owned it, just grunted every now and then, tossing in lazy comments like, "Yeah, I could use some good food." And Thomas? He sat there next to Rita, silent as always, staring out the window like he didn't have a care in the world. I didn't say a thing, not one word. My teeth were clenched so hard my jaw ached, and every mile we got closer to the airport, I felt this weight pressing down on my chest, heavier and heavier. They didn't even notice I wasn't talking. Didn't ask how I felt about Caleb taking my place on the trip I'd spent 2 years planning. 2 years of late nights at work, 2 years of skipping my own little joys, like that fishing rod I'd wanted or the weekend trips I'd passed on, just to make this happen for them. And now here I was, driving them to catch a flight I wasn't even on, with a guy who couldn't pay his own rent sitting in my spot. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, and I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears. Every laugh from Rita, every excited squeal from Marla, every smug little noise from Caleb. It was like a hammer hitting the same nail deeper into my skull. I'd always known, deep down, that I was more of a tool to them than a person. The guy who paid the bills, fixed the leaks, drove the car. A placeholder. But hearing it play out like this, so loud and clear, made it impossible to ignore anymore. Marla didn't even look at me when she talked, just kept her eyes ahead, dreaming out loud about croissants and cobblestone streets. Caleb adjusted his seat, stretching out like he was already on the plane, and I caught a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror, smirking like he'd won something. Won what? My wife's attention? My family's approval? My money? My whole body felt hot, like I was burning up from the inside, but I kept my face blank. I'd learned a long time ago how to hide what I was feeling. Years of swallowing disappointment had made me good at it. When we finally pulled up to the airport, I parked at the drop-off zone and got out without a word. The air outside was cool, but it didn't calm me down. I popped the trunk and started unloading their bags. Marla's overstuffed suitcase, Rita's fancy leather one, Thomas's beat-up old duffel, and Caleb's cheap, scratched-up case that looked like it had been dragged through the dirt. They didn't even help, just stood there chatting while I hauled everything onto the curb. "Thank you for understanding," Marla said, her voice all chirpy, like she was tossing me a bone. She leaned in, gave me a quick hug that felt more like a pat on the head, and then turned away. I forced a smile, tight, fake, the kind that hurt my face, and watched them walk toward the terminal. Caleb slung his bag over his shoulder, Rita tugged Thomas along, and Marla waved once without even looking back. My heart was still pounding as I slid back into the driver's seat. One hand stayed on the wheel, the other reached for my phone. They were gone now, out of sight, but I could still hear their voices in my head, laughing, planning, acting like I didn't matter. The car engine hummed as I sat there, staring at the terminal doors they'd disappeared through. Understanding? No, Marla, I didn't understand. But I was about to do something about it. My thumb hovered over the screen, and I knew right then, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I didn't head straight home after dropping them off at the airport. I just sat there in the car for a while, engine off, staring at the dashboard like it might tell me what to do next. My chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a rope around it, and kept pulling. 2 years of work, 2 years of dreaming about this trip, and they'd kick me out of it like I was nothing. Marla's voice echoed in my head. Caleb needs some rest, and I could still see that smug look on his face as he climbed out of my car with his suitcase. My suitcase should have been there instead. My trip, my family. I shook my head, started the engine, and drove back to the house. It was quiet when I walked in, too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you feel alone even when you're used to it. I dropped my keys on the counter, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat down at the kitchen table. The cold bottle felt good in my hand, something solid to hold on to while my mind spun. I took a long sip, then another, letting the bitter taste settle on my tongue. They were probably at the gate by now, laughing, checking their boarding passes, not even thinking about me. That's when it hit me. I didn't have to just sit here and take it. This wasn't their trip. It was mine. I'd made it happen, every single piece of it. I pulled my laptop over, flipped it open, and logged into the travel accounts I'd set up. My fingers hovered over the keys for a second, but then I started typing. First, the flights, first-class seats I'd saved up for, picked out so Marla could stretch her legs and Rita could feel fancy. I found the booking, clicked cancel, and watched the screen ask me if I was sure. Was I sure? Yeah, I was sure. I hit confirm, and just like that, they were gone. Refund pending. A little rush went through me, like I'd just taken something back. Next, the hotels, 5-star places with big beds and views I'd spent hours researching. Paris, London, Rome, all canceled with a few clicks. The confirmation emails started popping up in my inbox, one after another, like little victories piling up. Tours. I'd booked private guides, wine tastings, a boat ride on the Seine gone. Dinners at restaurants Marla had drooled over when I showed her the menus. Canceled. The car service I'd arranged to pick them up at every airport. Refunded. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen as the last email came in. Everything I'd built, every detail I'd poured myself into, was undone. It felt strange, like I'd just torn down a house I'd spent years building, but it also felt right. They didn't get to take me out of the picture and still keep the frame. My beer was half empty now, and I took another swig, letting the cold wash down the heat in my throat. I pictured them landing in Paris, dragging their bags to the check-in desk, all excited until they found out there was no reservation. No car waiting. No fancy suite with a balcony. Caleb would probably shrug, like it wasn't his problem. Marla would call me, furious. Rita would complain. Thomas would just stand there, quiet as ever. And they'd have to figure it out, without me. Let Caleb step up for once, if he even could. I almost laughed, thinking about him trying to sort out a mess like that. He couldn't even figure out how to pay his phone bill, let alone a luxury trip. I closed the laptop and stood up, stretching my arms over my head. The house was still quiet, but it didn't feel so heavy anymore. I'd taken the trip away, just like they'd taken my place away. Fair's fair, right? I grabbed another beer and walked over to the couch, sinking into it. My phone sat on the table, screen dark, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. They'd land soon enough, and then the calls would start. I wasn't going to pick up, not yet. Let them sweat a little. Let them see what it's like when the guy they counted on stops counting them in. For the first time all day, I felt like I was breathing again, like I wasn't just the backup plan anymore. I cracked open the second beer and took a sip. This was my night now, and I was going to enjoy it. I was sprawled out on the couch, nursing my third beer, when my phone started buzzing like an angry bee. The screen lit up with Marla's name, and I just stared at it for a second, letting it ring. They must have landed by now, Paris, probably, judging by the time. I could almost see them standing at the airport, confused, waving their passports around like that'd fix whatever mess they were in. The buzzing stopped, then started again. Rita this time. I didn't move. A minute later, a voicemail popped up, then another, then a third, Marla again, then Caleb. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and hit play on the first one. Rita's voice came through, sharp and screechy, like she was yelling at a waiter who'd messed up her order. What do you mean there's no reservation? We're standing here at the hotel, and they're saying the suite was canceled. This is ridiculous, fix it. I deleted it before she finished. The next one was Marla, her tone all fire and venom. What did you do? The car wasn't there, the hotel's got nothing, and we're stuck. You can't just leave us like this. I snorted, deleted that one too. Caleb's was last, low and whiny, like he was trying to sound tough but couldn't pull it off. Dude, this isn't cool. Why isn't the car here? The hotel's acting like we're crazy. What's going on? I tossed the phone onto the cushion next to me and leaned back, a grin tugging at my lips. Not cool? Yeah, well, neither was kicking me off my own trip. I got up, grabbed another beer from the fridge, and cracked it open as more voicemails rolled in. I didn't even listen to them, just watched the little icons stack up, one after another. Marla again. Rita. Marla. Caleb. It was like a chorus of panic, and I was the conductor who'd walked off stage. I pictured them at the hotel desk, Marla waving her hands, Rita huffing, Caleb probably just standing there looking lost. They'd figure something out, or they wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't my problem anymore. I took a long sip, the cold fizz hitting my throat, and kicked my feet up on the coffee table. The house was dark except for the glow of the TV I hadn't bothered to turn on. My phone buzzed again, text messages now. Marla, this isn't funny. Call me. Rita, you've ruined everything. Caleb, bro, seriously? I didn't reply. Just deleted them, one by one, like I deleted their fancy trip. It felt good, better than I'd expected. Every time I hit that little trash can icon, it was like I was wiping away a piece of the weight they'd piled on me for years. I'd always been the guy who fixed things, when the car broke down, when the rent was late, when Marla needed someone to lean on. And what did I get? A front row seat to them picking Caleb over me. I leaned my head back, closing my eyes for a second, and let myself imagine it, them dragging their bags around Paris, trying to find a cheap hostel or something. No first-class flights, no five-star suites, no private tours. Just them, stuck, with nothing but their own bad choices. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced at it, another voicemail from Marla. I hit play this time, just to hear how far she'd go. Her voice was shaking, angry, almost breaking. We're exhausted, we've got nowhere to go, and the hotel says it's all canceled. What's wrong with you? Fix this. I laughed out loud, couldn't help it. Fix it? Nah, I was done fixing their messes. I deleted it, took another sip of beer, and turned the phone face down. They hadn't wanted me in Europe with them, fine. But now they needed me, didn't they? Funny how that worked. I got up, stretched, and walked to the kitchen to toss the empty bottle. The clock on the wall said it was late, but I wasn't tired. If anything, I felt awake, really awake, for the first time in a long time. I grabbed another beer, popped it open, and sat back down. The voicemails kept coming, but I stopped checking. Let them pile up. Let them yell into the void. They'd taken me out of their little adventure, acted like I didn't matter, but now they were stuck, and I was here, free. I took a slow sip, savoring it. This wasn't just about the trip anymore. It was about me taking something back, my pride, my control, myself. And it felt better than any vacation ever could. I was halfway through a sandwich, ham and cheese, nothing fancy, when the phone rang again. It had been quiet for a couple hours, long enough that I'd started to relax. But there it was, buzzing on the counter like a fly that wouldn't quit. Marla's name flashed on the screen. I chewed slowly, staring at it, letting it ring a few more times before I wiped my hands on a napkin and picked up. I didn't say anything at first, just held it to my ear and waited. Her voice exploded through the line, loud and shrill, like she'd been holding it in too long. "What did you do?" she shouted, not even bothering with a hello. I swallowed my bite, leaned back against the counter, and kept my tone flat. I canceled the trip. Silence hit the other end, heavy and thick, like she hadn't expected me to just come out and say it. Then she snapped back, her words dripping with venom. "You're being dramatic. This is ridiculous." I laughed, a short, sharp sound that surprised even me. "Dramatic? You replaced me with your boyfriend and thought I'd still fund your fantasy vacation? That's the ridiculous part, Marla." She sputtered, like she couldn't find the right comeback, and I could almost see her pacing wherever she was, her face red, her hands waving. "He's not my boyfriend," she finally said, her voice tight. He's having a hard time, okay? We were trying to help him." I rolled my eyes, even though she couldn't see it. "Yeah, I bet he's real broken up about it, lounging around Paris on my dime. Or he was, anyway." She didn't like that. "You didn't have to do this. You've made everything a mess. We're stuck here. No hotel, no nothing, and it's all your fault." "My fault?" I gripped the phone a little tighter, but I kept my voice steady. "No, Marla. You made a choice. You picked him over me. All I did was make mine." She tried to turn it around, like she always did when she knew she was losing. "You're being selfish. Caleb needed this, and you just had to make a scene, didn't you? You couldn't just let us have this one thing." I shook my head, staring at the crumbs on my plate. "One thing? 2 years, Marla. 2 years I worked for that trip, for us, for your parents, for something special. And you gave my seat to a guy who can't even pay his own rent. Don't talk to me about selfish." She went quiet again, but I could hear her breathing, fast and shaky, like she was trying to figure out how to twist this back on me. Then she went for the guilt trip, her favorite move. "You've embarrassed us. Rita's furious, Thomas won't even talk, and Caleb, he's sleeping on a bench right now because of you. How's that supposed to make me feel?" I didn't bite. "Sounds like Caleb's problem. Maybe he can charm his way into a hostel. He's good at leaning on other people, right?" Her voice cracked, and I knew she was mad, really mad. "You're heartless. I can't believe you'd do this to us." "Heartless? After everything?" I took a deep breath, letting the word hang there for a second. "You did this to yourself, Marla. You wanted Caleb along for the ride? Well, now you've got him. Enjoy it." Before she could say anything else, I hung up. The phone clicked off, and the kitchen went silent again, just me, my sandwich, and the hum of the fridge. I stood there, staring at the screen as it went dark, waiting for the anger to hit me again. But it didn't. Instead, I felt light, like I just dropped a bag of bricks I'd been carrying around too long. I tossed the phone onto the counter, picked up my sandwich, and took another bite. It tasted better now, somehow. She'd call again. I knew she would. Rita too, probably, and maybe even Caleb, whining about how unfair it all was. But I wasn't going to pick up. Not tonight. I finished my sandwich, rinsed the plate, and grabbed a glass of water. The house felt different, still quiet, but not empty anymore. I walked over to the couch, sank into it, and let my head rest back. "Heartless," she'd said. Maybe. But for once, I wasn't the one bending over backwards to fix everything. For once, I'd stood up for myself. And as I sat there, the weight I'd felt all day just kept slipping away, piece by piece, until I could finally breathe again. This wasn't over, not yet, but I'd made my move, and it felt good. I was still buzzing from the phone call with Marla when the doorbell rang the next afternoon. I opened it to find Paul, My best friend since high school, standing there with a six-pack of beer in one hand and a grin on his face. Heard you had a wild night, he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I shut the door behind him and shrugged. Something like that. He plopped the beers on the coffee table, cracked one open for himself, and handed me another. Tell me you didn't let them get away with it, he said, settling onto the couch like he owned the place. I took the beer, popped the cap, and smirked. Check your email. I forwarded you the screenshots. Paul's eyes lit up, and he pulled out his phone, scrolling through the messages I'd sent him, the canceled flights, the hotel refunds, the whole mess. He let out a loud, barking laugh that filled the room. You're a legend, man. They thought you'd just, what, drive the getaway car for their affair and wave bye-bye with a smile. I sat down across from him, taking a sip of the beer. Pretty much. 2 years I worked for that trip, and they swapped me out for Caleb like it was nothing. Paul shook his head, still chuckling. Caleb? That guy? He can't even tie his own shoes without help. And Marla thought he'd, what, fit right into your first-class seats. I nodded, the memory of it still sharp. She said he needed rest. Like I'm running a charity for her deadbeat friends. Paul leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his grin fading into something more serious. You know what this is, right? It's not just about the trip. It's about respect. They've been walking all over you for years, and you finally put your foot down. I stared at the beer in my hand, turning the bottle slowly. He wasn't wrong. I'd spent so long trying to keep everyone happy, Marla, her parents, even myself sometimes, that I'd let them treat me like a doormat. Yeah, I said quietly. I guess I did. Paul clapped his hands together, breaking the moment. And it's about time. I mean, come on, man. They thought they could ditch you and keep the fancy vacation? That's some next-level nerve. He took a long swig of his beer, then pointed at me. You're too quiet sometimes, you know that? People think they can push you around because you don't make a fuss. But this was loud. This was you saying, not anymore. I couldn't help but smile a little. Didn't feel loud. Just felt, right? He nodded, like he got it. That's the best kind of loud. The kind they don't see coming. We sat there on the porch after that, the afternoon sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the yard. The air was warm, and the beer was cold, and for the first time in a while, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of everyone else's problems. Paul kept talking, tossing out ideas about what they might be doing in Paris right now, stuck in some dingy hostel, maybe, or arguing over who'd pay for a cab. Bet Caleb's whining about his back already, he said, laughing. Guy's got the spine of a jellyfish. I chuckled, picturing it. Probably. Marla's already called me a dozen times, yelling about how I ruined everything. Paul raised an eyebrow. And? What did you tell her? I shrugged. Told her she made her choice. Hung up. He whistled, long and low. Cold, man. I like it. We clinked our bottles together, and I took another sip, letting the moment settle. Paul was right. This wasn't just about the trip. It was about loyalty, about betrayal, about me finally seeing that I didn't have to keep taking it. You know, he said after a while, I've been waiting for you to snap like this. You're too good a guy to let them keep treating you like that. I looked out at the yard, the grass needing a trim, the fence I'd been meaning to paint. Maybe I was too good, I said. Not anymore. Paul grinned again. That's my boy. Now what? You gonna let him crawl back and beg forgiveness? I shook my head. Not this time. They can figure it out without me. He laughed again, loud and free, and we sat there talking until the sun went down about old times, about how sometimes the quietest guys make the biggest moves. For once, I didn't feel invisible. Paul saw me, really saw me, and that was enough for now. I was sipping coffee on their porch, Marla's parents' place, when I heard the car pull up. The sun was just starting to set, painting the sky orange, and I'd been waiting there for about an hour, cup in hand, letting the steam warm my face. I'd driven over after work, not because they asked me to, but because I wanted to see their faces when they got back. The car doors slammed, and I looked up to see Marla storming toward me, her heels clicking hard against the pavement. Her hair was a mess, her eyes narrowed, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Behind her, Rita shuffled along, lips pursed tight, and Thomas trailed with his usual blank stare. Caleb was last, dragging his suitcase like it weighed a ton, his shoulders slumped. I took a slow sip of coffee, keeping my eyes on them as Marla stopped a few feet away, hands on her hips. You embarrassed us, she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Caleb had to sleep in a hostel because of you. I set the mug down on the porch railing, leaning back in the chair I'd pulled out from their garage. Must have been tough, I said, keeping my tone even. Bet the free Wi-Fi helped, though. Her face went red, and I could see her jaw tighten. Rita stepped up next, clutching her purse like it was a shield. You could have just let us enjoy the trip, she snapped, her voice high and whiny. We were stranded, no hotel, no car, nothing. It was a disaster. I tilted my head, looking at her. You could have brought your own wallets, I said, standing up slow and brushing off my jeans. I gave you a gift, 2 years of my work, and you gave my seat to a stranger. Don't worry, Rita. I won't make that mistake again. Marla threw her hands up, exasperated. A stranger? Caleb's not a stranger. He's our friend, and he needed this more than you did. I glanced at Caleb, who was hanging back, staring at the ground like he hoped it'd swallow him up. Yeah, he looks real needy, I said, nodding toward his scuffed-up suitcase. What did he contribute, Marla? A sob story? A couple bucks for coffee. She glared at me, but she didn't answer. Didn't have to. I already knew. Caleb shifted his weight, muttering something I couldn't hear, and I didn't care to. Thomas just stood there, hands in his pockets, like he wasn't part of this at all. Typical. I picked up my mug, took another sip, and let the silence stretch out. Marla crossed her arms, her foot tapping. You think this makes you a big man? Ruining our trip? Leaving us to fend for ourselves? I set the mug back down, meeting her eyes. I think it makes me done, Marla. Done being the guy you all lean on while you hand my stuff to someone else. You wanted Caleb? You got him. How'd that work out? Rita huffed, turning her nose up. It was humiliating. People staring at us. No place to go. Because of you. I shrugged. Sounds like a you problem. I wasn't the one who picked a freeloader over family. Marla stepped closer, her voice dropping low, like she was trying to sound tough. You're acting like a child. We could have talked about this. I laughed. Couldn't help it. Talked? You didn't talk to me when you gave my ticket away. You didn't ask. You decided. And I was supposed to just nod and drive you to the airport. That's not talking, Marla. That's using. Her mouth opened, then shut, and I saw the fight flicker in her eyes. She didn't have a comeback for that one. I grabbed my jacket off the chair, slinging it over my shoulder. I'm glad you're back safe, I said, stepping off the porch. But next time you want a vacation, figure it out yourselves. I'm not your bank anymore. Marla called after me as I walked to my car. This isn't over. You can't just walk away like this. I didn't turn around, just opened the driver's door and slid inside. Watch me, I said, loud enough for her to hear, then started the engine. The tires crunched on the gravel as I pulled out, leaving them standing there. Marla fuming, Rita scowling, Caleb useless as ever, and Thomas silent. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. The coffee was still warm in my stomach, and the air coming through the cracked window felt good on my face. They'd expected me to cave, to apologize, to fix it like always. But not this time. I turned onto the main road, the porch fading out of sight, and felt something settle in me. Something calm, something strong. They'd made their mess. Now they could clean it up. I woke up the next morning with the sun sneaking through the blinds, hitting my face just enough to pull me out of sleep. The house was quiet. No phone buzzing. No voices yelling at me through the line. For the first time in days, I didn't feel that knot in my chest, that heavy twist of anger and hurt. I rolled out of bed, stretched, and shuffled to the kitchen to make coffee. The pot hissed and gurgled as it brewed, filling the air with that rich, dark smell I loved. I stood there, leaning against the counter, and let my mind settle. Yesterday on the porch, facing Marla and her parents, I'd drawn a line. They weren't going to cross it again, not if I could help it. I poured the coffee into a mug, took a sip, and decided it was time to start rebuilding. Not their mess, but my life. I'd been putting off a project for years, fixing up the old shed out back. It was a rickety thing, half buried in weeds, but I'd always wanted to turn it into something useful, a workshop, maybe, or just a place to sit and think. I grabbed my toolbox from the garage, pulled on some old jeans and a flannel shirt, and headed outside. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes you up, and I started yanking out the overgrown grass around the shed, feeling the dirt under my nails. It was hard work, but good. Every tug and pull felt like I was clearing out more than just weeds. I spent hours out there, hammering loose boards back into place, sweeping out the dust and cobwebs. My hands got sore, my back ached, but I didn't care. It was mine, something I was doing for me, not them. By afternoon, the shed was starting to look like something again, and I sat on an old crate inside, wiping sweat off my forehead, sipping water from a bottle. It wasn't done yet, but it was a start. That night, I booked a solo trip, just a weekend in the mountains, a little cabin I found online. No fancy hotels, no first-class nonsense, just me and some trees and a lake. I packed a bag, threw it in the truck, and drove up the next morning. The road twisted through the hills, and I kept the windows down, letting the wind whip through the cab. When I got there, I dropped my stuff in the cabin and walked down to the water. It was quiet. No one around. Just the sound of the lake lapping against the shore and birds chirping somewhere high up. I sat on a rock, staring out at the ripples, and felt my shoulders loosen. This was what I'd needed. Not Paris, not Rome, just this. Back home a couple days later, I sat down at my laptop and pulled up the shared bank account, Marla's favorite ATM. She'd been dipping into it for years, treating it like her personal piggy bank, and I'd let her because I didn't want the fight. Not anymore. I moved what was mine into a new account, one she couldn't touch, and closed the old one out. Then I blocked Caleb's number. No more whining texts, no more excuses. My phone felt lighter after that, like I'd shaken off a leech. Marla sent a string of messages later that day, long ones, trying to explain herself. It wasn't about you, she wrote. Caleb just needed help, and I didn't think it'd hurt you like this. I read them, let them sit there for a minute, then typed back one line. It's your turn to figure things out without me. I hit send and closed the app. No more back and forth, no more guilt trips. The silence that came after was golden, pure, clean, like the air in the mountains. I leaned back in my chair, hands behind my head, and looked around the living room. It wasn't much couch, TV, a few pictures on the wall, but it was mine now, not ours. I got up, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and cracked it open. The shed still needed work, and I'd probably head back to the mountains soon, but for now, I just sat there, letting the quiet wash over me. They'd taken me for granted too long, counted on me to hold everything together while they did whatever they wanted. Not anymore. I took a sip, the cold hitting my throat, and smiled to myself. This was my time now, my terms, my rules. And I wasn't going back. I woke up one morning about a month later with an itch I couldn't shake, a need to get away, but this time on my own terms. The shed was coming along, the mountains had cleared my head, and I'd started feeling like myself again, not just the guy who fixed everyone else's problems. I grabbed my coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. No more waiting, no more planning for other people, I was going somewhere for me. I scrolled through a few travel sites, sipping my coffee, and landed on Rome. Not the big, flashy trip I'd planned before, but something simpler, just me, a backpack, and a cheap flight. I booked it right then, no hesitation, and felt a little spark light up in my chest. A week later, I was on a plane, wedged in a middle seat with my knees cramped, but I didn't care. The hum of the engines felt like freedom. When I landed in Rome, the air hit me, warm, thick with the smell of bread and exhaust, and I grabbed my bag and stepped out into the chaos. No car service, no fancy hotel, just a little hostel I'd found online with a bunk bed and a shared bathroom. I dropped my stuff off, pulled on some sneakers, and started walking. The streets were narrow, all cobblestone and cracked, with scooters zipping by and old women shouting from windows. I didn't have a plan, just a list in my pocket of things I wanted to see, stuff I'd picked for myself. I wandered to the Colosseum first, standing there with my hands in my pockets, staring up at the old stone arches. It was bigger than I'd imagined, rough and real, and I liked that. No polish, just history. I grabbed a slice of pizza from a little stand nearby, hot, greasy, perfect, and ate it leaning against a wall, watching people go by. Tourists with cameras, locals with bags of groceries, kids chasing each other. I didn't feel like I had to rush or check in with anyone. It was just me, and that felt good. Later, I found a gelato shop, pistachio, cold and sweet, and walked with it to the Trevi Fountain. The water sparkled under the lights, coins glinting at the bottom, and I sat on the edge, licking the spoon clean. I didn't toss a coin in, no wishes needed. I was already here. Night fell, and I kept going, strolling through alleys that twisted and turned until I ended up at the Spanish Steps. They were crowded, people laughing and taking pictures, but I found a spot halfway up and sat down with a notebook I'd brought. I scribbled some thoughts, nothing deep, just how the air felt, how the gelato tasted, how I could hear a guitar playing somewhere below. I looked out at the city, all lit up and alive, and realized something. I'd forgotten who I was before all this, before Marla, before Caleb, before I started shrinking myself to fit their needs. I wasn't the guy who just nodded and took it. I was the guy sitting here, writing in Rome, eating gelato at midnight because I wanted to. The next day, I hit the Pantheon, marveling at the hole in the roof and the way the light poured in. I walked along the Tiber River, watched the water ripple under the bridges, and stopped at a cafe for espresso so strong it jolted me awake. Every step, every bite, every scribble in my notebook was mine, no one else's. I didn't have to share it, didn't have to check if anyone else was happy. Back at the hostel, I'd lie on my bunk at night, listening to the guy above me snore, and grin to myself. No matching luggage, no fake smiles, no Caleb trailing behind like a lost dog. Just me. On my last day, I climbed a hill to a little park overlooking the city, sat on a bench, and watched the sunset. The sky turned pink and gold, and I felt this quiet settle over me, not heavy, but warm. I'd proved something to myself here. I wasn't the afterthought, the backup, the guy they could swap out. I was enough. I packed up that night, my backpack a little heavier with a few souvenirs, postcards, a cheap keychain, and flew home the next morning. When I walked into my house, dropped my bag by the door, and breathed in the familiar smell of wood and coffee, I knew I had left something behind in Rome. Not a coin in the fountain, but the old me, the one who let himself be less. And I wasn't going back to that. I was watering the plants in the living room, something I'd started doing to keep the place alive, when I saw the mail truck rumble by outside. It had been a few days since I got back from Rome, and I was still riding that high of being on my own, doing what I wanted. I set the watering can down, wiped my hands on my jeans, and stepped out to the mailbox. The usual stuff was their bills, a flyer for a pizza place, but then I saw it. A plain white envelope with Thomas's shaky handwriting on the front. My name, no address, just dropped off by hand. I stood there for a second, staring at it, then took the stack inside and tossed everything else on the counter. I grabbed a coffee mug, filled it from the pot I'd brewed earlier, and sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of me. Part of me wanted to rip it open. Part of me wanted to chuck it in the trash. Thomas never said much, barely spoke during all this mess, so what could he have to say now? I took a sip of coffee, letting the steam curl up around my face, and slid my thumb under the flap to tear it open. The paper inside was thin, folded once, and his writing was small, like he was trying to fit too much into a tiny space. We didn't realize how much this would cost us. It started. Not just money, but you. I paused, mug halfway to my mouth, and read it again. Cost them? My eyes moved down the page. Rita's still mad. Marla won't stop talking about it, and Caleb's gone off somewhere. But I keep thinking about you driving us to the airport, not saying a word. I should have seen it then. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking under me, and let out a slow breath. Thomas, the quiet one, the guy who always faded into the background, had noticed. I kept reading. We took you for granted. I did too. I'm sorry. That was it. No big speech, no excuses, just those few lines and his name scratched at the bottom. I set the letter down, staring at it like it might say something else if I looked hard enough. Sorry. After everything, Marla's yelling, Rita's whining, Caleb's freeloading. Thomas was the one to write this? I got up, refilled my coffee, and walked to the window, looking out at the yard. The shed stood there, half finished, a reminder of what I'd started building back. I didn't know what to do with his words. Part of me wanted to call him, say something, but what? Thanks. Okay. Too late. I didn't know him a response, or any of them. I took the letter back to the table, folded it up, and tucked it into a drawer. Maybe I'd deal with it later, maybe not. For now, I grabbed my notebook, the one I'd scribbled in on the Spanish Steps, and flipped it open. The pages were messy, full of Rome and gelato and little thoughts I jotted down when I felt free. I picked up a pen and added something new. Never shrink myself again. I stared at the words, letting them sink in, then closed the book. That was my goal now, not just a trip or a project, but a promise. I wasn't going back to being the guy who nodded and drove while they handed my life to someone else. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, and stepped outside to the shed. The air was cool, the sun low, and I picked up a hammer to keep working. Each nail I drove and felt solid, like I was nailing down that promise too. My phone stayed quiet, no calls from Marla, no texts from Rita, and I liked it that way. Thomas's letter was the last word from them, and I didn't need to add to it. I'd said what I needed to on that porch in those cancellations in Rome. I wasn't their driver anymore, their bank, their fix-it guy. I was done carrying their betrayal like a backpack I couldn't take off. As the sun dipped below the trees, I stepped back, wiping sweat off my brow, and looked at the shed. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Just like this life I was piecing together now. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, cracked it open, and sat on the porch steps, the cold bottle sweating in my hand. The stars were starting to peek out, and I took a long sip, letting the quiet wrap around me. From now on, I wasn't just along for the ride, I was the destination, and that was enough.